The rain fell thinly over the abandoned field. Small rivulets of water ran down the dry leaves that covered the ground, and the mist hung thick, obscuring the shapes of the landscape like a veil over forgotten memories. Everything there seemed to have stopped in time. The trees, stripped of their leaves, extended their branches like dry arms towards the pale sky. The cold was biting, but silent, as if even the wind had learned to respect the mourning of that place. The imaginary camera would slide slowly over the muddy ground, revealing the trail of old rails, crooked and covered in rust. Ahead, an abandoned train station loomed out of the fog. Its cracked walls and broken windows seemed to bear the weight of many departures. The wooden sign still hung fragilely, held together by a single crooked nail. It was written Volgastroy, -1941 nearby. Almost hidden under a pile of damp leaves and mud, a small wooden box remained half buried, as if patiently waiting to be remembered. Its surface was rough, with signs of age and small cracks. In the center of the lid, in almost faded letters, a name could still be read. Yelena. Despite the years, she resisted. The box was locked but not sealed, and what he kept inside seemed to pulse, as if the words contained there were still breathing. The scene then changed to the past, decades earlier. In that same place, the station was no longer a ruin, but alive, crowded with people. It was early autumn, the sky was still gray, but the world was moving. Lines of young soldiers waited for the boarding call, some with a look of bravery, others with fear hidden in the corners of their eyes. Mothers cried in silence, wives held tightly to their husbands' arms. Girlfriends stretched out the minutes, as if they could stop the train from leaving just by looking at them. In the middle of that crowd was Konstantin, his uniform freshly pressed, the buttons still shining. He was in his early 20s, and had a look that tried to appear firm, although it revealed a certain fragility. The backpack on his back was light. He carried the most weight inside. His eyes searched the crowd, and when he found her, time seemed to stop. Yelena was walking among the others. He was wearing a dark wool coat and a scarf tied around his neck. Her hair, tied up simply, swayed in the wind. In one hand she carried a fabric bag, in the other, a white scarf that he held tightly. Her eyes searched for him with restrained anxiety, and when they finally met, no words were spoken. They just got closer. Konstantin touched her face lightly. Yelena smiled sadly, and then, with a delicate gesture, she slid her hand into his coat pocket, depositing something small and discreet. He just watched her, feeling the warmth of that touch, even with the biting cold. She held his hands for a few seconds. Their eyes said it all. Fear, anticipated longing, hope, fragile as glass, and a love that didn't need to be confessed. The train whistles sounded, sharp, cutting through the moment like a knife. The moment faded. The soldiers began to board. Konstantin hesitated for a moment, then went up. Through the window, his eyes never left Yelena. She remained there, motionless, holding the white scarf, now shaking in the wind. As the train began to move, she raised her hand in an almost imperceptible wave. He responded in kind, with a slow, painful nod. The distance between them grew quickly. Within seconds, he no longer saw her. He leaned his forehead against the cold window. Inside the carriage, the sound of wheels on tracks filled the space, mixed with the muffled voices of soldiers. Some laughed loudly, others were dozing, but Konstantin remained silent. Sitting on his wooden bench, he reached into his coat pocket and took out what she had placed there. It was a letter, carefully folded and tied with a red ribbon. He looked at it for long minutes, running his fingers over the paper, feeling the relief of the letters across the envelope. He didn't open it, saved it again, as if I didn't need to read it to know what it said. Outside, the landscape ran quickly. Fields, villages, shadows. The world was heading towards war. Back to the present, the station was once again grey, abandoned. The wooden box was still there, now on a table. Female hands, aged by time, touched its lid carefully. The silence was heavy. The world, once again, was at a standstill. The clock on the wall ticked, tick, tick, ticked, and outside, the rain continued to fall, as if it had never stopped. Before it all began, before the uniforms, the letters, the goodbyes, and the war, there was a time when Konstantin and Yelena just existed in each other's world, without knowing how precious that would be. Konstantin worked as an assistant in a small railway workshop in the city of Sizeran, a cold city, crossed by tracks and smoke. He was the type of man who said little but observed everything. He had grease-marked hands and eyes that lingered on details, the way the sun reflected off the tracks at dawn, or the way the snow fell slowly in the first days of winter. He lived with his father, a retired railway worker, and divided his days between work, borrowing books and long walks along the banks of the Volga River. Yelena was the daughter of a teacher. She had the grace of someone who didn't try to attract attention, but was always noticed. He worked as an assistant at the city library, and in his spare time, he voluntarily helped at a small nursing station. She was known for her calm manner, her restrained smile, and her deeply attentive eyes. He read more than he spoke, but when he spoke, his words had weight. The first meeting between the two was not memorable, and maybe that's why it was so real. The train workshop where Konstantin worked was close to the library, and it was common for him to pass by there at the end of the day, attracted by the silence of the place, where books rested like soldiers after battle. One autumn afternoon, when he pushed open the building's heavy wooden door, he found Yelena sitting at the counter, copying by hand an excerpt from an old Russian novel. The room smelled of aged paper and tea. She barely looked up. He just said, in a calm tone, that the librarian was absent, but that he could look at the books at will. That was it. He thanked her, searched some shelves and left. The next day, he returned, and the other one, too. On each visit, I would borrow a single book, always chosen carefully, just to have a reason to return. Sometimes she would comment something about the author. Other times, they said nothing, but there was something about the way the silence between them fit together. No rush, no obligation. One morning, she noticed that he had returned her copy of Dostoevsky without marking the pages. It was strange. "Did you read everything?" he asked, as he wrote down the next loan. He just nodded. "And did you like it?" Konstantin hesitated. Then he replied, simply yes, especially the part where the character remains silent, even with so much to say. She didn't respond, but smiled, and that smile stayed with him for the rest of the day and of the week. The bond grew like this, in small gestures. He started leaving dried flowers between the pages of the books he returned. She reciprocated with notes marking passages she thought he would like. Neither of them talked about feelings. There were no statements, just presence, constancy, looks that lingered for a moment longer than necessary. Small pauses between sentences, as if the two were unconsciously creating a story between the lines. As the months passed, the meetings became part of the routine. They sometimes walked together through the snow-covered streets, without touching hands, but always side by side. They drank tea in silence in the library's small cafeteria. He told stories about the trains and the sound of the engines. She talked about the patients at the medical center, about how the war, even though it was still distant, was already starting to leave its marks. Their approach was not interrupted by a hasty kiss or an impulsive confession. It was built the way you build something you want to last, little by little, as if they both knew that the world, at any moment, could turn upside down, and it did. Konstantin's summons came in early autumn, a stamped envelope, delivered without ceremony. Inside, a direct order, East Front, uncertain fate. He didn't say anything the first day, just showed up in the library like always. He handed over a book. He took another one. Yelena noticed the difference in the look, in the grip of the hand. The next afternoon he went to her. It was cold, and the leaves were already forming golden carpets on the ground. They walked along a section of the river. They stopped at the bridge. It was there that he said bluntly, "I go." She understood. They stayed there, in silence, for long minutes, hands close, but not touching, like always, like never again. The following week he would leave. She would go to the station. He had promised to write. She had promised to wait. They looked at each other, for the first time, as if they knew that this moment would be kept in both of them, even if everything else was lost with time. The sky was overcast that day, as if it knew what was about to happen. A layer of low clouds covered the city and made the air denser, heavier. The wind blew coldly, scattering dry leaves. Across the cobblestone streets, the city, although used to the harshness of winters, seemed even grayer that morning. The train station was taken. Men in fresh uniforms and still clean boots carried backpacks full of clothes, rations and souvenirs. Many looked too young to hold weapons, and even the most experienced ones had something between fear and acceptance in their eyes. Officials shouted orders. trying to maintain organization while mothers, wives and sisters tried to stretch out the last few minutes before departure. Konstantin arrived early. The uniform, freshly ironed, hid the folds of anxiety that grew in his chest. He had his backpack on his shoulders, and, in the left pocket of his coat, he carefully kept the letter that Yelena had given him 2 days before. He hadn't opened it. He knew that when he did, something inside him would change. So I kept the envelope closed, like an anchor. Yelena appeared a few minutes later. He walked with firm steps, without rushing, although every part of his body seemed to be fighting against time. He wore the same dark coat, the same light scarf around his neck. Her hair was tied up simply, but more delicately than usual. He carried a small cloth bag with dried fruit and cookies wrapped in waxed paper. When Konstantin's eyes met hers, everything around lost sound. The tumult of the station, the train whistles, the officers' shouts, all dissolved into silence. The two approached. Neither of them said a word. It wasn't necessary. Yelena handed him the bag with the groceries. He held it with one hand and, with the other, touched her arm through the fabric of her coat. She returned the touch, for just a moment, but with enough force for him to feel it. The minutes that followed were silent. They walked together along the station dock, passing groups of soldiers and family members. They didn't look at each other all the time, but remained close, as if their bodies were already learning to say goodbye. When they arrived at the boarding point, Konstantin took out a small, folded photo that he kept in his wallet. It was of the two of them, in front of the library, taken months before by a friend. He offered it to Yelena, without saying anything. She took it carefully and, for a moment, looked away to stop the tears from flowing. The train whistle sounded loudly. The locomotive released a thick cloud of steam. It was time. The crowd stirred. The soldiers began to board. Many turned to hug their families one last time. Others were already at the windows, waving or trying to hide their nervousness. Konstantin looked at Yelena as if he wanted to commit her face to memory. With his free hand, he touched his face lightly, running his thumb over his cold cheek. She closed her eyes, leaning into the touch for a moment. Before he turned to climb into the carriage, Yelena quickly reached into the inside pocket of her own coat and pulled out a small embroidered fabric handkerchief. On it, he had sewn the name, Konstantin, with red thread. She handed it over carefully. He kept the handkerchief next to the letter, in the same pocket on the left side. The climb into the carriage was slow, as if your feet felt heavier with each step. Upon reaching the platform, he turned around one last time. Yelena remained motionless, with her arms crossed, holding her own coat as if she needed to keep herself together. Her eyes were fixed on his. The train started to move. Smoke covered part of the view. Konstantin remained at the window, with one hand resting on the glass and the other clutching the pocket where his silent treasures were. The handkerchief, the letter, the promise. Outside, Yelena raised her white scarf and waved. It was a small movement, almost timid, but filled with everything that had not been said. As the train gained speed, her image became smaller, more distant, until it disappeared completely. Inside the carriage, Konstantin remained motionless. Beside him, a young soldier told nervous jokes to distract from his fear. Another slept with his head against the gun, but he didn't hear anything. He stared at the dirty glass of the window, trying to capture in his mind the last vision of Yelena standing there, on the platform, with her scarf raised and her heart in her throat. The letter was still intact. The seal had not yet been broken. It would be like this for many days. Before continuing, if this story has touched your heart so far, if for a moment you saw yourself at that station, with a heavy heart and teary eyes, then now is the time to be part of it. Leave a like now. It shows you want more stories like this. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything that's coming. Here, each story is written with soul, emotion, and a truth that crosses time. And hold your breath, because in the next chapter, you will discover the promise that Konstantin made to Yelena. A promise made in silence, amid the cold, uncertainty, and fear. But it would give rise to something much greater, a love written day after day, even without knowing if anyone would read it. Stay with me. The story is just beginning, and what comes next will shake you. The train moved eastward, cutting through fields covered in thick fog. The constant sound of the wheels on the tracks was like a heartbeat, steady, uninterrupted, inevitable. Inside the carriage, the world was already beginning to change. Uniforms were no longer just new clothes and gained the weight of reality. The conversations, once anxious and nervous, gradually fell silent, giving way to solitary thoughts. Konstantin remained sitting by the window, looking lost in the landscape that was moving too quickly to be recognized. The handkerchief with his name embroidered on it was still in his pocket, next to the letter he hadn't had the courage to open. He touched the two objects from time to time, as if by doing so he could maintain some connection with what he had left behind. As night fell, the temperature inside the carriage dropped with it. The soldiers made themselves comfortable as best they could, seeking some comfort in thin blankets and shared cigarettes. Outside, the darkness was total. Only small distant lights indicated that the world continued to exist beyond that trip. Konstantin couldn't sleep. He took a small brown-covered notebook and a pencil from his backpack. It opened to the first page. He looked at the blank paper for long seconds. The hesitation only lasted until the train rocked gently. So, he started writing. The words came out slowly, as if they still didn't know if they had the right to exist. But over time, the hand became firmer. He didn't write like someone writing a report or a formal letter. He wrote like someone speaking softly to someone they love. And that night, he said everything he hadn't said before the match. He told about the train, about the cold, about the faces around him. He spoke of the tightness in his chest when he couldn't say goodbye out loud. He remembered the way she held his hand, the warmth in her eyes, the way her white scarf fluttered when the train left. He ended the page by saying that he didn't know if she would ever read those words, but that she would write them anyway. He closed the notebook and put it back in his backpack, well protected between two pieces of clothing. That was the first page, the first day, the first letter. Upon arriving at the training camp, the days began to follow a rigid rhythm: instructions, marches, orders. Little time to breathe, almost none to think. But every night, without fail, Konstantin took his notebook out of his backpack and wrote. It didn't matter the tiredness, the cold, or the fear. Writing had become his ritual, a refuge, a silent commitment to Yelena and to himself. Each entry in the notebook began with the date, approximate location, and, just below, a new letter. He wrote as if she were there, by his side. As if, when he finished, he could hand her those pages and see her smile, in the calm and shy way she always smiled when she looked at him in silence. The themes of the cards changed according to what was happening around them. Some were light, telling small episodes of the day, a joke told by a comrade, a moment of rest in the sun, a piece of bread shared with another soldier. Others were heavy, full of confessions and anguish, the sound of gunshots in training, the sight of a man fainting from exhaustion, the increasingly present longing. There were days when Konstantin almost couldn't write. Fear clung to his throat, and his body hurt more than he would admit. But he forced himself. He told himself she deserved to know, even if she never read it. He said that as long as he wrote, something inside him would remain intact, human. Some soldiers mocked him. They thought it was strange, that silent young man who spent his nights writing in a notebook. One of them, curious, asked who he wrote so many letters to. Konstantin just replied, to someone who is everything I can't forget. After that, no one asked any more. Time began to distort. The days seemed longer, and the nights shorter. War was approaching. Soon they would be sent to the battlefront. But Konstantin kept his promise. I wrote, every day, even if there was no post office, even if the letters weren't delivered. He no longer wrote just for her. I wrote so as not to forget who I was. He wrote to keep alive the part of himself that Yelena had touched, because in that notebook, among the dates, memories and words saved, he was still the same man who had seen her wave at the station, with a white scarf and teary eyes. And even if the war took everything from him, friends, home, even his own voice, he would have recorded what was truest, the love he felt, the memory he carried, the promise you made. The cold came early that year. In the military field, soldiers were no longer clean faces in new uniforms. Their boots were dirty, with dried mud, their eyes were tired and their voices were shorter. Konstantin adapted to the rhythm of the nameless days, to the orders shouted at dawn, to the dark nights in which the sounds of the wind mixed with fear. But at the end of each journey, when silence finally enveloped the canvas tents and the men tried to sleep with the rifle nearby, he still lit a small candle. His shelter was narrow and poorly sealed against the cold, but there was space for the ritual he rigorously maintained. opening the notebook, removing the pencil, adjusting his posture, and writing to Yelena. The first letters he wrote had an almost hopeful tone. They were simple descriptions of the routine. He talked about the training camp, the tasteless food, the sound of footsteps in the early hours of the morning. He told about the other soldiers. There was one who dreamed of being a pianist, another who had never seen snow before. He described the faces, the gestures, the small details that she would ever see, as if, by writing them, he managed to bring her there for an instant. He would tell her about the grueling workouts, but he would always add something gentle at the end. Thought about the smell of her hair, the warmth of her hand, the memory of an ordinary day walking the streets of Saran. It was as if each letter was a point of balance between two worlds, the one he lived in now, and the one he had left behind. On the fourth night he wrote about the first snow. She had arrived, silently, like a secret. During the night, the camp was covered with a white layer that hid the marks of footsteps and wheels. When Konstantin woke up and opened the tent canvas, everything looked immaculate. He wrote that he thought of Yelena. Immediately there was something about the way the snow silenced the world that reminded him of her presence. Some letters he tried to send, even without knowing if they would arrive. There were makeshift mailboxes at the camp, but officials did not guarantee that they would be emptied regularly. Even so, he folded the paper carefully, placed it in envelopes, and wrote her name in firm handwriting. In others, without an address or possibility of sending, I simply wrote and kept it in my notebook. In all of them, there was a mixture of tenderness and vulnerability. Konstantin did not write like a man trying to impress. He wrote like someone trying to stay alive inside. And perhaps that was what made each word more true. On an especially silent night, after a day of exhaustion and punishment, he wrote a longer letter. He didn't mention the exercises or the punishment. He preferred to describe a dream he had had with her. They were both in the library, like old times, and she was reading an excerpt from a book out loud while he just listened, with his head resting on the table. He wrote that he woke up smiling, and that smile lasted until the sergeant's first scream. In the next letter, he talked about the sound of music, played on a distant accordion. Someone across the field played the same tune every night. He sat near the entrance to the tent just to listen. He said the song made him think about what life was like before all this started, and that he imagined her dancing with her eyes closed, slowly twirling in a light-colored dress, as if in a memory that might never have actually happened, but that was still real to him. The letters piled up. Some already had worn edges, folded and unfolded many times. Others were stained by coffee spills or small drops of water, perhaps rain, perhaps tears that he would never confess. Every word was written carefully. There was no room for haste, nor for lying. The world around him could collapse, but there, between the lines, Konstantin preserved what was purest: the image of Yelena, the memory of the touch of her hands, the unforgotten sound of her voice calling his name. He wrote because he had to, because it was the only way to keep the part of himself alive that didn't belong in the war. And even if the letters never arrived, even if no one read them, he would continue writing. Because writing to her was remembering who he was before the shots, before the screams, before the trenches, and because, somewhere inside him, there was the silent hope that one day even, if it was many years from now, Yelena would open those pages and understand how much she had been loved. The war arrived like a grey, heavy wave, dragging everything in its path. There were no more organized camps or repetitive training. What existed now was the front, the fine line between life and death. The ground is frozen and cut by craters, the sky darkened by the smoke of the cannons, and the silence before each attack, which hurt more than the sound of the explosions themselves. Konstantin and his platoon were positioned in a remote area, north of the front line, where the winter was cruelest and the fighting most intense. The arrival was marked by a long march, foot, made during the night, with heavy backpacks and fear hanging on each man's shoulders. The conditions were inhumane. The hastily dug trenches were collapsing under the snow and rain. The cold was a constant enemy, as treacherous as enemy soldiers on the other side of the earth. Fingers froze easily, feet no longer felt the ground, and hunger was a presence that could not be forgotten. The first week was enough to change all the faces around. The looks became deep, hard, and the smiles disappeared completely. Even the most optimistic now walked with their heads down. The sound of bombs in the distance was a constant reminder that nowhere was safe. Konstantin began to sleep with the rifle against his chest, but he did not let go of the notebook. Every night, when I wasn't on watch, or when I wasn't falling asleep exhausted, I opened the little brown cover and wrote. The words, once careful, became more raw. There was less room for poetry. Now, what he recorded was the brutality of each day. He wrote about a companion who went mad after 3 sleepless nights, about another who lost his fingers because of the cold, about the constant smell of gunpowder and blood. He wrote about the muffled sound of screams when someone was hit, and about the silence that followed. There was an excerpt in one of his letters in which he described the moment when a boy in the platoon, barely 18 years old, died after stepping on a mine. Konstantin didn't cry at the moment, just looked, and he wrote later that he felt as if a part of him had been hit there too. Yet, amid the horror, there was still room for remnants of humanity. One day, while collecting bodies after a clash, he found a flower sprouting among the rubble, small, almost invisible, but alive. He carefully collected it and stuck it between the pages of the notebook, writing to Yelena that, even there, among death and mud, life still insisted on existing. The letters, although stained with pain, continued to carry memories of her. He clung to Yelena's image like someone holding onto a thread of light in an endless tunnel. He described in detail moments they had experienced, the smell of the library, the sound of her laugh, the taste of the cinnamon tea they drank once during a cold afternoon. Recreating these moments on the page was his way of surviving. As the weeks passed, Konstantin began to notice that he was changing. The mirror in her small toiletry bag showed a thinner, harder face, but what scared him most was the silent transformation inside, a certain torpor, as if the heart was beginning to shield itself to withstand the pain. He wrote about it. He said he didn't want to forget who he was. That writing to her was his way of remembering. One night, after a more violent attack than normal, it rained for hours. The trenches flooded. Injured men screamed for help as mud invaded everything. There was nowhere to step. Feet sank in despair. Clothes stuck to the body. The rifle was as heavy as lead. That night Konstantin did not write. The first time since the beginning, he slept badly, face down, hugging his closed notebook. The next day, when he woke up, he wrote 2 letters. The first short one, just to register that he was still alive. The second, long, like a confession. He talked about the fear of dying. Not the fear of pain, but of disappearing without being able to tell her how much she meant, how much she saved him every day, just by existing in his memory. Over time, he and the other soldiers lost track of the days. Time was marked only by watch shifts, machine gun fire, and casualties. There were no calendars, but he numbered each letter carefully, as if they were the only timeline that mattered. On one of the last pages of that winter, he wrote a sentence that he scribbled, rewrote, erased, and then decided to keep. If someday I don't write, maybe it means I'm finally not back. But until then, every word of mine will be for you. And he closed the notebook with his hands covered in dirt. Konstantin never expected immediate answers. He knew that war mail was unstable, that the paths between letters and their destinations were long, uncertain, often cut off by explosions and blockages. Even so, he remained hopeful that, at some point, Yelena would open a letter from him and, touched by those words, would write back. In the early days, he looked expectantly every time an officer walked by with a bundle of envelopes. When names were called, he remained silent, listening attentively. Some companions received news from their mothers, wives, sisters, short messages, hastily scribbled, with simple phrases such as, "We are fine, come back soon, we pray for you." They were words that carried the weight of survival, of those who waited, even without knowing what exactly to expect. But Konstantin's name was never called. For the first 2 weeks, he tried not to get upset. He thought that perhaps Yelena had sent the reply too late. Maybe the letter was on its way, or perhaps he had gotten lost among the destroyed villages and the paralyzed trains. These were times of confusion. Nothing was guaranteed. He insisted on believing that her silence was a circumstance, not disinterest. But time passed, 3 weeks, a month, and no response. Silence began to echo inside him with more force than any explosion around him. In every break between battles, when he lay down, even exhausted, he thought of her and her absence. The words that didn't come, in the envelopes that didn't arrive. He began to imagine 1,000 scenarios. Perhaps she had been forced to leave the city. Perhaps he was ill. Perhaps his parents had forbidden any communication. Maybe she had simply stopped waiting for him. The war transformed everything, sometimes even feelings. At first, his letters remained full of tenderness, as always, but little by little, they gained a new tone. There was still affection, there was still memory, but, mixed with restlessness, with doubts that he tried to control, but that escaped between the lines. One night he wrote, "I haven't heard back yet, Yelena, but I'm still writing. Maybe my letters got lost along the way, or maybe you're too busy to respond. I would understand. I just hope that, wherever you are, you know that I think of you every day, that I still hear your voice in the pauses between shots." The next day he wrote again, this time just one line, more like a whisper than an actual letter. "Do you still think about me?" He didn't have the courage to keep that page with the others. He tore it up and buried it under a rock near the trench. It was strange how heavy the silence was. The war was noisy, shouts, bombs, gunfire, orders, but there was something unbearably dense in that empty space where a word of hers should have been, as if he spoke to a shadow, as if writing to an echo. His teammates noticed, not that he complained or commented on anything, but the shine in his eyes, already rarefied, became more opaque. The letters continued to be written, yes, but with longer pauses, with shorter words. Sometimes he would start a letter and stop in the middle, leaving the page blank to resume the next day. On a freezing December night, during a silent truce between two attacks, he wrote what was perhaps his most honest letter. "Yelena, I don't know if you're going to read this. Maybe you don't even know that I'm still alive. Maybe you don't even remember me like I remember you, but still, I write, because it's the only way I can still exist outside of this place. If these pages ever reach you, even if very late, I just want you to know that I never expected anything more than a word from you, any word, because your absence weighs more than this entire warfield." He folded the sheet carefully, tied it with the remaining red ribbon, and placed it at the bottom of his backpack. After that, he remained silent for a long time, looking at the cloud-covered sky where no stars dared to appear. Other soldiers began to say that it was better to stop writing, that the war did not allow this type of attachment, that it was easier not to feel anything than to live waiting. But Konstantin didn't listen. Or, if he heard it, he refused to accept it. He knew there was something bigger in all of this, that Yelena's silence didn't erase what they had experienced, and that love, even lonely, was still love. And so, even without an answer, even the face of emptiness, he continued writing, because, deep down, I still believed that a letter would one day arrive, and perhaps, with it, a single line written by her, enough to reignite everything. Time passed, and with it, the chances of sending the letters diminished. At first, Konstantin still delivered some to the officer responsible for correspondence, even though he knew that most of them would never leave the front. There were lines to deliver the envelopes, soldiers eager to send, used to mothers, wives, children. Makeshift mailboxes were full, and transportation was irregular, often interrupted by bombings or cuts in supply lines. After a while, Konstantin stopped asking if the letters were gone, not because he had given up on Yelena, but because he began to realize that, perhaps what he wrote belonged elsewhere, in a space where there was no need for a response, delivery, or confirmation of receipt. It was as if the words had become a kind of testimony, a record, an attempt to preserve what the war tried to destroy daily. This is how the diary was born. Not an ordinary diary, with reflections or technical reports, but a hand-stitched notebook, made by himself, with strips of leather, yellowed paper, and the meticulous care of someone who knew that, even in times of destruction, beauty still needed to exist. He sewed the pages together, with thread taken from a blanket. He created a cover with pieces of waterproof fabric and engraved with the tip of a pocket knife. On the inside, a simple inscription: "For when all this is over, this diary became home to all the letters he was unable to send. I no longer folded papers or put them in envelopes." He wrote directly on the pages, numbering each one as if they were chapters in a secret book. Page 1, Day 37 of campaign. Page 2, Night of bombing. Page 3, When I missed the smell of your hair. Thus, the days gained a name, the pain gained color. The silence around, so oppressive, began to be filled with lines filled with love, pain, memory and hope. He wrote about everything. about the comrades who began to waste away inside, about the voices that shouted meaningless orders, about the hands that trembled when they held the trigger. But I also wrote about her, about what I imagined Yelena was doing at that moment. If you still worked at the library, if you still wore the same light scarf around your neck, if I thought about him when the wind hit the window at night. The cards are no longer linear. Sometimes they seemed like loose conversations. Other times, they were memories told in almost photographic detail. The day they drank tea for the first time, the moment she corrected his posture while holding a book, the afternoon he realized he was in love and didn't know what to do with that feeling. He once wrote 3 entire pages just about the sound of her laughter, trying to describe it, comparing it to bells, to a light wind, to a song you hear for the first time and never forget. The diary grew. With each new page, it became heavier, not because of its volume, but because of its content. It was like carrying an entire world inside your backpack, a world of his own, a world where she still existed. At times, Konstantin thought about stopping. There were days when everything seemed pointless, when the mud reached up to the knees, the blood ran between the fingers, and death was so close that it seemed to whisper in the ear. But on those same days, when I opened the diary and saw the pages filled, I felt a kind of silent resistance, as if, while he was writing, the war had not managed to overcome him completely. He started hiding the diary in different places. Sometimes he buried him in metal boxes, wrapped in cloth and pieces of leather. Other times, I hid it under boards or between makeshift walls. It was a treasure, a reliquary. He couldn't afford to lose him. More than once he dreamed of Yelena finding that notebook. I imagined her sitting in a garden, her diary open on her lap, reading each word calmly, perhaps crying, maybe smiling, but reading, living with him, even if belatedly, every moment he recorded. The diary was no longer just a promise, it was a living memory. And even though Konstantin wasn't sure he would ever return home, even though the world he knew had been reduced to trenches and gunfire, he knew that as long as those pages existed, something true would also exist. Because every word written was proof that, despite everything, he was still capable of love. And that, amidst the destruction, there was still room for tenderness. In the city of Sizeron, the weather had also changed, not in the same brutal way as in the trenches, but in a silent, subtle, and relentless way. The air felt heavier, people are quieter. The fear didn't come from the bullets, but from the eyes. Looks that observed, judged, took notes. Yelena continued her routine at the auxiliary hospital hastily set up inside a closed school. The windows had been boarded up. The rooms, once full of desks and children's voices, now housed beds with injured men, some screaming in pain, others in silence, staring at the ceiling as if seeking a kinder heaven there. She cared for the wounded with dedication. I changed bandages, heated soups, wrote notes to families. But there were days when his mind was far, far away in a muddy field, in the east, where he believed Konstantin still breathed. In the first months after her departure, Yelena wrote almost every day, long letters, some brief, but all full of feeling. He talked about life in the city, about the changes in the library, about the notes he found hidden among the books, as if his love still left traces even after he left. However, all his letters returned unanswered. Some were returned by military mail with red stamps, receptor not located, unknown unit. Others simply disappeared, and the void left by this grew day by day. Yelena continued writing, even without knowing if he would receive them, even without knowing if he was alive. But then something changed. One late afternoon, as she was leaving the hospital, she was approached by 2 men in dark uniforms. They wore no visible badges, but everyone in town knew who they were. One of them called her by name. The other said nothing. He just handed him a subpoena. The next morning, she was supposed to report to the regional security office. The next day, she dressed soberly, tied her hair tightly, and took with her a folder with documents and receipts from the library. She hadn't done anything wrong, or at least, that's what she told herself. The room was small, stuffy, lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. On the other side of the table, an officer with an impassive face was leafing through some sheets with official stamps. Beside him, another man watched her in silence. The questions started calmly: where he worked, who he lived with, how long he had known Konstantin. Then they became more direct. Why did I write so often? What did you put in the cards? What type of information did you send? Yelena responded firmly, but her hands felt sweaty. He explained that it was not about anything military, just feelings, memories, affections. But each sentence seemed to fuel their suspicion, not dispel it. They made her write one of the letters there, in front of them, and then they read. They turned the sheet over from all sides. They looked at it as if they expected to find, hidden between the lines, some coded word, some threat to the state. After that day, she knew she was being watched. She was not arrested, not even officially warned. But I learned, in the following days, that I was being observed. Some residents avoided greeting her. Library colleagues began to move away, and the censorship of his letters became even more evident. Some were intercepted before even leaving the city. Others appeared to have been opened and closed again with subtle, almost imperceptible marks. But there, she stopped mentioning Konstantin's name in public. I avoided talking about him even with my closest friends. He started writing the letters and keeping them at home, inside a metal box hidden under a loose board on the bedroom floor. Even at risk, he was unable to stop. It was her way of not forgetting him, of believing that, despite the silence, he still existed somewhere, and that perhaps he was also writing, even without knowing if she would read it one day. In that box, there were dozens of letters. Some were stained with tears, others were written during sleepless nights, others were written in a hurry, during breaks from work, just to ensure that not a single day would pass without him knowing that she was still waiting for him. Yelena began to close the letters with red ribbons, like the one she had placed on the first one, before he left. It was a symbol, a sign for him. If he ever saw a letter like that, he would know it was from her. On a blackout night, lighting a candle near the window, he wrote perhaps his most vulnerable letter. It started with a question, "Are you still alive, Konstantin?" And it ended with a sentence that took her a long time to write. "If you're gone, I hope you take with you everything I was to you, because I'm still, even here, alone." He folded the paper carefully, tied it with the red ribbon and put it in the box. The next morning, he saw a man in a dark overcoat standing across the street, pretending to read a newspaper. She didn't look away. Yelena was no longer afraid. There was love, and it was for him that he continued. Winter imposed itself brutally. There was no longer the precarious comfort of improvised trenches. Now Konstantin's platoon was in constant motion, retreating and advancing, like pieces on a board that no one seemed to really control. Orders arrived without explanation. One day, they slept in dark caves. In the other, they marched through open fields, covered in snow and half-buried corpses. Time seemed crushed between now and never. And the men, little by little, stopped being soldiers. They became specters. Konstantin no longer knew how many days had passed since his last letter. Maybe 3, maybe 7. He had had a fever for 2, maybe 3 days, but it refused to stop. Each step was supported by pure stubbornness, or by some invisible force. Yelena's name in thought, repeated like a mantra. He still carried the diary. It was the only object I cleaned. Regularly, he would remove the mud with a dry cloth, keep it wrapped in pieces of fabric, and hide it carefully next to his body, as if it were part of himself. The pen had broken weeks ago, and now he wrote with charcoal, or whatever scraps of graphite he could scrape off, discarded pencil scraps. The night before the tragedy, the platoon had been ordered to take shelter in a destroyed house on the outskirts of an abandoned village. The walls were partially standing, and the roof, although damaged, offered some shelter from the snow. The unused fireplace became an improvised trench. There, Konstantin found a dry corner, lit a very short candle, wrote a few lines in the diary, and fell asleep with the diary clutched to his chest. The next morning, the silence seemed longer than usual. The wind had stopped blowing. The tree branches were motionless. The sky, absurdly white, seemed to hold its breath. Something was wrong. At around 5 o'clock, the first impact came. A bang, then a second. The house shook. Part of the ceiling collapsed, covering the center of the room where 5 soldiers were sleeping with debris. One of them died instantly. Another was trapped by his arms. Screams began to spread. Konstantin woke up with a dazed body. The sound of gunfire outside indicated they were under attack. An aerial bombardment, sudden, cruel, like so many others, but, this time, with too much precision, as if someone knew exactly where they were. Smoke filled the room. A second, Impact knocked down one of the side walls, and the weight of the structure fell on the group trying to exit through the door. Chaos ensued. Mixed voices, shouting orders, moans, gunshots. Konstantin tried to get up, but a piece of wood hit him in the side of the head. He fell to his knees, dizzy. Blood ran down his temples, but he was still breathing. He tried to drag himself to the corner where he had slept, where the diary was. When he found it, the diary was covered in dust and stone chips. It was intact, but dirty. He wiped it off with his bare hands, shaking, and put it inside his coat. I didn't know if I would survive, but he knew that the words, what he had written to her, could not be lost. In an attempt to exit the side of the house, he was hit from behind by a piece of debris. The pain was acute, the vision blurred, and then, the dark. No one could say what happened to him after that. When reinforcements arrived at the scene, they found bodies, frozen blood and debris. Of the more than 30 men there, only 10 were clearly identified. The rest were buried in mass graves, without a name, without a plaque, without a farewell. Konstantin's name was included in the list of those missing. There was no body, there was no certainty, just absent sand in war. Absence was a silent sentence. The news reached the city months later, a generic statement, signed by some official, saying that Konstantin Petrovich Mikhailov was considered missing in action in the Novgorod region. It was not known whether he was dead, injured, or captured. The document was cold, bureaucratic, as if someone's life could be summed up in a typed sentence. Yelena received the news in the middle of the street. He didn't cry there. He took the paper, folded it carefully, and put it in his bag. He returned home, took out the box with his hidden letters, and, for the first time, did not write anything. He just sat by the window and waited for night to fall. Deep in the chest, there was a silent, dull pain and a confused certainty that something remained. That, despite everything, he still existed, even if it was in the words that had been written. Words that perhaps no one would ever read. Still, she continued to wait, because love, even wounded, even silenced, still pulses. Konstantin and Yelena. When the war finally ended, there was no party for Yelena. The city's streets were taken over by flags, improvised parades, voices trying to celebrate what was left. Men returned, little by little, marked by visible scars and others that no one would ever see. Families hugged each other with despair and relief. Children ran through the squares without understanding the real meaning of peace. But Yelena watched everything from afar. She was sitting on the steps of the library, her dark coat tight around her body and her hands wrapped in worn gloves. His eyes followed each face that passed by, each uniform, each lost look, each hug received. None of them were Konstantin. He would not return that day, not the next one. In fact, it had been months since the last news. Officially, he was still considered missing in action, but for all intents and purposes, to his neighbors, his co-workers, those who whispered in the streets, he was already another statistic, a number engraved on a collective tombstone. Yelena didn't accept it. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was faith, maybe just too much love to give up. She got on with her life, like everyone else, but the difference was in the details. The library, gradually rebuilt, began to function again, and Yelena went back to work there, cleaning shelves, organizing books damaged by the dust of abandonment. The attendees were few, but enough to make the days seem normal. She spent hours in silence in the corridors, arranging volumes that no one else read, touching spines as if touching memories. At home, everything remained as before. The table with 2 chairs, the cup of tea she placed next to yours on cold nights, the box with the letters hidden under the floor, and it was the letters that she became attached to. Even without knowing if it still existed, Yelena decided to continue writing. Not every day, like before, but regularly. Always at night. Always with the same red ribbon to close the envelopes, even if they were never sent. In these new letters, she talked about the reconstruction of the city, about the small victories of everyday life, the bread that was once again sold without queues, the garden that she had started to cultivate with cold-resistant herbs and flowers. But, above all, I wrote about him, about how she still remembered the sound of his voice, about how afraid he was of forgetting her face, her smell, the exact shape of her smile. Sometimes I asked if he was alive. In others, he apologized for not having sought him out more insistently. There were nights when I just wrote his name, repeated dozens of times on an entire sheet of paper, as if that were enough to prevent time from erasing it completely. The war was over, but the love, that remained intact. Maybe more mature, maybe quieter, but intact. One morning while walking through the market, Yelena passed a newspaper stand. I didn't usually buy it. I didn't really trust the news that came out in print, but something caught his attention. On the bottom side of the cover, a small, almost imperceptible note listed soldiers located alive in liberated prison camps in the north. She approached, and her eyes ran over the names as if searching for something impossible. Did not find Konstantin Mikhailov, but he found others who, months earlier, were also presumed dead. Hope was rekindled, small, fragile, but live. That night, she wrote again, but it was different. Instead of just putting the letter in the box, he picked up a new envelope and walked to the post office. The girl at the counter hesitated when she saw the name of the recipient and the vacant location. Possibly, prisoner, Northern Front. Even so, he stamped it and placed it with the others. As someone who respects the faith of others, even without sharing it, Yelena returned home in silence. He sat down by the window, and for the first time in months, he lit a candle and left it there, burning to the end. She didn't know if he would see her, but I knew there was still something moving, because the end of the war did not bring the end of waiting, not the end of love. And in the silence of the room, the flickering shadow of the flame, she whispered his name again, like prayer, like longing, like a promise made by those who remain. The years passed like a slow, silent river. They didn't take Yelena with them, but they carved out their routine with the weight of their absence. She hadn't left town. I was still in the same house, with the same furniture, the same daily paths. The library had new paint, new shelves, new readers, but her desk, near the window overlooking the cobblestone street, remained unchanged, a little world where she organized books, wrote down index cards, and sometimes lost herself in memories no one else shared. Konstantin's name was no longer mentioned, not because it was forgotten, but because it had become something too sacred to say. It was present in the silences, in the small gestures, in the letters that were still written and kept with the same red ribbon, year after year. It was on a cloudy September afternoon, at the end of a regular working day, that everything began to change. Yelena was already preparing to close the library when a young man appeared at the door, dirty with dust, breathing heavily and a wooden box in his hands. He was dressed in simple clothes, worn boots, and watchful eyes. He didn't seem lost, he seemed guided by something he couldn't explain. She looked at him with the serenity of someone who had already learned not to be impressed by the unexpected. He approached the counter, placed the box on the wood, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and said, with a light accent, "I found this in a hut near the old front line, in the Karbashevo forest. It was buried under rocks and mud. I almost didn't take it, but I saw a name engraved on the lid. I thought maybe it was important." Yelena didn't respond right away. He looked at the box as if he couldn't believe what he saw. It was small, with worn hinges. The wood was darkened with age, but there, in the center, it was still possible to read the name carved. With a knife tip, Yelena. Her hand shook as she touched the lid. For a moment, everything round disappeared. The young man, the library, the sound of the street. There was only that box, and what she carried inside. He opened it slowly. Inside, wrapped in darkened fabric, were dozens of pages. Some folded, others stitched, some written with graphite, others with charcoal, others almost erased by humidity. But they all had something in common: handwriting, Konstantin's handwriting. Yelena brought her hand to her mouth, as if holding back an old scream. The eyes filled with tears, but they did not overflow. He touched the papers with extreme delicacy, as if each sheet were alive. She immediately recognized the features, the way he wrote the date in the top corner, the way he spoke to her as if she were there, reading, responding. "Did you meet him?" she asked, her voice cracking. The young man shook his head negatively. "No, I just found the box. She was buried in a dark corner of the fireplace. I thought it belonged to some commander. Then I saw the name and the papers." She thanked him with a nod. The boy understood that he shouldn't ask anything else. He left in silence, leaving Yelena alone with what she had expected for years, and no longer expected. She sat with the box on her lap, near the library window, where the natural light still reached. He started reading, page by page. No rush, with reverence. The first letters were soft, almost hopeful. They talked about the field, training, dreams. Then they became harder, more dense. The descriptions of the trenches, the deaths, the absences, the raw longing, the fear of forgetting the sound of her voice, the doubt of being forgotten. And then, persistence. Even without a response, he continued writing. Even though he was injured, he continued writing. Even without knowing if he would live to see her again, he wrote. On one of the last pages, written with shaky strokes and stained with dried blood, there was a silent confession. If someone ever finds this and brings it to you, Yelena, know that I wrote every day. Even when I couldn't speak, even when I couldn't walk, even when the world already seemed to have ended. She clutched the paper to her chest. I didn't cry anymore. It was something else, a kind of deep, sad, beautiful relief. Like finding the grave of someone you love after years of searching, and finally having a place to rest their memory. The war had ended, time had passed. But there, in that box, Konstantin still existed. I live in every word, present on every page. At that moment, Yelena knew she was not alone in waiting. He had waited for her too, every day. The wooden box sat open on the library table for hours. Little by little, the sounds of the surrounding world disappeared. The conversations in the street, the church bells, even the creaking of the old shelves seemed to fall silent in front of what was happening there. The past had finally caught up with the present, and it imposed itself with a serene, unquestionable weight, like a truth that waited too long to be told. Yelena remained sitting with the cards in her hands, as if touching something alive. The heart beat slowly. There was no rush. Nothing else in the world required speed. She was finally going to read it. He opened the first page with steady hands, even though his entire body was shaking inside. Konstantin's handwriting was a little faded, but recognizable. His handwriting was simple, orderly, and each stroke seemed to contain a clear intention, almost a voice. The letter began with a simple story. He talked about the journey on the military train, about the cold he had felt the first few nights, and how he imagined that she, at that very moment, was having tea at home. He told the surrounding scene in detail, not like a report, but as if he were painting a picture for her to see. Yelena smiled. It was as if he was speaking in your ear, as if the distance between the past and that exact moment was dissolved with the turn of each page. He continued reading. The letters were linked together like chapters of a story that she already knew, but only from the outside. Now she was in the know. I knew what he felt every day, the anguish of her silence, the hope he insisted on maintaining, the words he told himself to keep from going crazy, the tenderness hidden in the simplest descriptions, the way he remembered her laugh, her eyes, the way she placed the scarf around her. Yelena read everything. He stopped sometimes, when the emotion threatened to suffocate him. Sometimes I closed my eyes, imagining the scenarios he described. The cold of the earth in your hands, the smell of smoke, the sound of machine guns in the distance, and, in the midst of all this, a phrase, a memory, an imagined gesture of hers, as if, without even knowing it, she had been by his side the whole time. Some letters were stained with water, others had smudges, tears perhaps. Still, others had simple drawings in the margins, leaves, stars, the silhouette of a house. One, in particular, had a sketch of a face, hers, poorly designed, unfinished, but unmistakably yours. She ran her fingers over that drawing, as if she wanted to bring the line back to life. The following letters became more intense. In the hardest periods of the war, Konstantin wrote with repressed anger, with pain. He described the losses, the sounds of men dying beside him, the hunger that made his legs bend, the fever that made him delirious. But even in those moments, there was always a paragraph that mentioned her, an excerpt dedicated to her, as if writing to Yelena was the only way to remember that he was still human. Yelena cried softly. She cried for him, for the days he spent alone, for the fears that she did not calm, for the words that never arrived. But he also cried with gratitude, because there, between those pages, there was love, not the fleeting, impulsive type, but the love that resists, who writes every day, even without turning back, that clings to the memory, even when everything around it collapses, which expresses itself not to be reciprocated, but because it needs to live somewhere outside the body. By the time he reached the last letter, the sun had already set. The library was dark, lit only by the yellow light of an old lamp. The last page was different. It was short. The words were shaky, disjointed, as if he had written without the strength Yelena needed. Some time before reading them, I felt like there was something definitive there. Then read. If you ever come across these words ... know that you kept me alive, even without knowing. You were my voice when everything was silent, my home when the floor disappeared. Yelena, I wrote every day, even when there was no more paper, even when my hands could barely hold the pen, even when I thought I would never see anything but snow and fire again. If you're reading this, then some part of me survived. And if this is the end of my story ... may it end with you reading what I wrote. She pressed the letter to her chest. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, it felt like he was there, sitting next to you, the same smell of grease and earth, the same silent presence that always accompanied her. Konstantin had written every day, and now, finally, she was reading. The library was completely silent. The world outside continued its course. Stores closed, lamps lit one by one. People's footsteps echoed along the damp sidewalks. But inside, in that small universe of wood, paint, dust and memories, time seemed to have stopped. Yelena remained seated, with her hands on Konstantin's diary. The last letter still rested on the table, next to the white handkerchief, with her name embroidered on it. The same one she had placed in his uniform pocket so many years ago. She didn't cry anymore. The tears had been replaced by something else. A strange, soft, deep peace. The peace of someone who, even without having all the answers, found what they were really looking for. All around, the old shelves held stories that no one read. But that night, there was a living story being read to the end. Yelena stood up slowly. He took each of the letters carefully and arranged them in order, from the first day to the last. He did with them what he had done with the memories he had of her. He gave meaning to the chaos. Then, he wrapped them all in a light fabric and tied them with the red ribbon he had used for so long as a silent symbol between them. He climbed the library stairs to the small back room, where no one rarely entered. There was an empty shelf there, reserved for personal files. He placed the diary there, along with the handkerchief and the blurry drawing he had made of her face. He closed the glass door carefully, locked it, and left the key inside an envelope. On the envelope, he simply wrote, "For those who love in silence." The next morning, he left the house before sunrise. The sky was clear, the air cold and calm. The streets are still empty. Walked to the train station, the same place where, years ago, I had seen him leave. The platforms had been restored. The new sign had replaced the old one, but she recognized every corner, every detail. He remembered the crowd, the whistle, the handkerchief raised in the air. She stayed there for a few minutes, standing still, watching the tracks. The same silence, the same emptiness, but now, no more waiting. Not by a train, not for one lap, but for herself. After the station, he walked to the river. There was a stone bench on the sidelines, where I used to sit with him on cold days, with cups of tea in their hands and books on their laps. The river continued its course, indifferent to what was happening on the banks. Like the weather, there, she opened a new letter. This time not written by Konstantin, written by her, not to send, not to save, but to deliver. He wrote about what he had read, about what he had felt, about the life that would follow with him in everything, in gestures, in silences, in small choices. Folded, the letter was left on the stone, with the same red ribbon. He got up without looking back. Over the next few days, he returned to his routine. Library, tea, silence. But something about her had changed. The eyes had a new shine, not of joy, but of completeness. Like someone who finally collected the pieces that were scattered around. And, even if some were missing, he could now see the complete picture. People greeted her again in the streets, not with pity, but with respect. Nobody knew exactly what had happened, just that she looked peace. Yelena's letters were no longer written with urgency or desperation. When he wrote, he acted as if he were talking to someone next to him. He kept the new pages next to the old ones, as if the story was still going on, even if the interlocutor was absent. Because their love didn't end with the war, not even with silence, not even with absence. He had transformed into something more, permanently, in legacy, in living memory. Many years later, as an elderly woman, Yelena returned to the library to donate some belongings. Among them was Konstantin's diary. He handed it over to a young librarian, with the same care as one would pass on an inheritance. "It's a story that needs to be read," he simply said, and, with a slight smile, he turned and walked away. That night, a new card was inserted into the catalogue he wrote every day, but she never read it, until the day he read it. And so, even after the end of everything, a love story survived time, war, and silence. Not because it was lived with intensity, but because it was written truthfully. And finally, it deals with the whole heart. If this story touched you in any way, if, for a moment, you felt that you too had waited too long, loved in silence, or kept words that were never said, so, I ask you, give back, like this video, share with someone who needs to hear this story, and subscribe to the channel, because here, each story is made with the soul to touch hearts and remember that love, true love, is never lost. And who knows, like Yelena, you too are about to open a forgotten box and find there everything that still needs to be read.